Okay, we're going to turn it over to Ashley. So, kill 'em.
Awesome. So I'll send a link, or I'll make sure a link gets sent out about this, but this should be a really good talk. Matt Bertone is the director of the Plant Disease and Insect Clinic over at NC State, and he's really wonderful. There's also going to be a talk in the series later in the season on ticks and tick-borne diseases, so this is kind of like just an interesting thing to keep an eye on. So I just wanted to share that real quick. So, some of you, well, you all know me, but you might feel like you don't really know me because I wasn't here for a while. Hi, I'm Ashley. Welcome to Durham. If you haven't been here before, our bathrooms are down the hall. Right? We have Cocoa Cinnamon on the corner with some lovely container gardens if you want coffee at the break. Yeah, we like being here. It's a fun location. We also have our demo garden out front, which has a bunch of mostly native pollinator-friendly plants. I taught the guard how to do it. Aha! Okay, and just a little bit of background on me. Why am I teaching entomology? So I originally came to Durham to go to graduate school at Duke, and I knew two things I was pretty sure of about school. One was that I wanted to study insects, because that's what I'd done in my undergrad, and two was that I didn't want to do field work, because that was not going to be the thing for me. So in the infinite wisdom of all 22-year-olds, what I actually ended up doing was field work on plants for 6.5 years. It's fine, but my background was definitely entomology, and this was an early passion for me. I actually ended up moving away from entomology. The moment I realized it was not going to be for me was I worked on dung beetles, not the ones that roll dung balls. I worked on the ones that bury dung. It's very good for the soil. It means you get to go out, you buy name brand Ziploc bags, collect a lot of dung, and grow your beetles on it. Don't cheap out on the bags. What I realized was I was supposed to be taking measurements on a beetle, and the way, unfortunately, we had to do that was you can't just measure the leg, you gotta pull the leg off and measure it so you really get it right.
Oh.
Science. It's a weird thing. So I had a beetle, I put it in ethanol, I put it in the -80, came back half an hour later, figuring this would be the end of the beetle. Well, I pulled the first leg off, and he was stiff, he was cold, right? And then as I was measuring the first leg, I kind of caught out of the corner of my eye this sort of slow waking up that was happening, right? And I realized, I have no idea what insects are doing, because that's wild. I would not survive the -80 in ethanol for half an hour.
Was that Fahrenheit or centigrade?
Centigrade.
Holy crap.
It was very cold. So, you guys, I feel you, and I moved away from it, like I am reformed, but also it was one beetle. We shed a tear for him and we move on. But I just realized that there's a lot about these insects, right? Like a lot about these creatures that they're operating in a really different way. And like that's very obvious with plants, because plants are actually so different from us. They're an independent evolution of multicellularity. But even with insects, they are going about their lives in such a different way. And so that's kind of part of what I want to imbue you with throughout this talk. One of the quotes that I absolutely love when we think about this is from the naturalist E.O. Wilson, that these are the little things that run the world, right? So we're going to do kind of a survey of the little things that rule the world. So it's an overview to orient you. Even before we get to the talk, we're going to spend about an hour, hour and a half on the talk. We're going to take a break, and then we're going to do activities so that you guys can actually think through some of these things for yourself, because insect logic makes a lot of sense on paper. And then you actually have to answer questions using insect logic, and you're like, I don't know what happened, right? So it's very helpful to kind of work through some of this together. So first, we're going to just do an overview of all about insects. You will very much find out that I am an evolutionary biologist by training. There will be a lot of that. I'm not actually that quotey. I just have a couple I really like. All things in biology make sense in the light of evolution, right? That's a good Jansky quote. We'll learn about insects in the ecosystem. Who did this? This is a way to identify not just insects, but also the sort of impacts you'll see on the environment. A lot of times you don't see the insect, right? You see the damage or the impact later on. Getting to know the neighbors, a little bit of an overview of insect orders, and how can we help. So what are insects? Insects belong to a group of animals called arthropods, right here. If you look at this, right, they are kind of in with this group that are the worms, the mollusks, So this is, in some ways you can think of it as an ancient group, but I often don't really like that way of viewing things. It's not that something evolved 100 million years ago and then stopped evolving. It's that it reached a form 100 million years ago and kept evolving. We just might not always see the differences. Within the arthropods, right, you have some usual suspects, right? Like crustaceans are the closest group. They're called the sister group to insects. It makes sense. Crustaceans kind of look oftentimes like bugs or sea bugs, right? Like they kind of have the overall sense. You also have spiders, trilobites, myriapods, which is going to be things like centipedes and millipedes. And part of what we'll talk about in just a second is, even though a lot of these critters look pretty different from each other, they have a really similar overall body plan, which often involves a hard outer skeleton, multiple segments, and multiple sets of paired legs. So the first insects appeared about 480 million years ago. For those not familiar, MY is always a million years ago. Around the same time as land plants. Insects really took to the land around the same time as plants did. They kind of worked together, and we'll see that throughout their evolution, like plants and insects have been very intimately tied. They first, flight evolved about 400 million years ago with a major radiation 350 to 300 million years ago. Most insects fly by, they literally shift an entire part of their body. It's not like the muscles are attached to the wings. It's like they literally, if you imagine I had wings on my back and you're like, instead of moving the wings, let's just pump your chest in and out so that the wings move, right? So it's kind of a counterintuitive way to what you would think of for something like a bird, which has really dedicated flight muscles directly attached. Yeah.
What does that mean, a major radiation around 350 to 300?
Sure, sorry, yeah, totally. Please stop me. So major radiation means that they went and there was a huge radiation of forms. There were so many different insects that appeared, right? So you're going to have flight evolving around 400 million years ago, but then actually for about 50 million years, it was kind of the same for most of the insects. And then 350 to 300 million years ago, they adopted all of these different ways of flying. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And sort of different wing shapes, different morphologies, so different ways that the wings are, right? The earliest modern insects then appeared about 250 million years ago, so most of what we see out and about is 250 million years ago or more recent. Some of those insects that were flying around 400 million years ago, a lot of them kind of look like earwigs, right? If we think about an earwig, right, where you have the kind of long skinny body, you have those little tailpipes, they're called cerci at the end, those little pinchers that look gnarly, and you kind of wonder which way is coming and which way is going on an earwig. And then we'll talk about this with pollination, but there was, again, a huge diversification. So many new insects appearing 145 to 65 million years ago during the Cretaceous. Does anybody remember what was happening from Matt's talk? One of Matt's many pre-lectures. It's okay if you don't remember. What was happening during the Cretaceous?
Flowering plants.
Flowering plants. Yes, flowering plants. So insects take to the land around the same time plants do, and they really diversify as flowering plants diversify. And so one of the cool things, and I find this so helpful and cool for thinking about what an insect is if you think about something like a centipede or millipede that has this sort of body shape, think about the ancestral arthropod, right? The arthropod that gave rise to the spiders and the crustaceans and the millipedes and the insects. It was probably shaped something like this. Many, many segments, each had its own paired legs, a head. And then actually, as the insects evolved, what they were doing was, you can see the segment number is reducing, right? You have fewer segments here than you had here. The leg number is reducing. The head is actually, if you think about an insect head where it's got mandibles and all these really interesting structures, some of those used to be almost more like legs and they were all pulled basically. The head is a highly condensed set of segments. The main part of the body is a highly condensed set of segments. And again, with the back, right? So they reduced the segment number, they reduced the leg number. But what's really cool about that, and it just blows my mind, is that in each one of these segments, you have all of this genetic programming, for example, to create a leg, okay? So what you do is you cram all these segments together and you stop producing legs there, you have all this kind of residual machinery that used to be used to create legs, but now isn't being really used for much. And that is a fertile ground for evolution. Evolution loves like an unused set of tools, right? Like it will figure out a way to make it into something else. It's so exciting. And so this is an example, right? So the ancestral insect, and what they're showing here is that the leg machinery and some of the kind of different developmental machinery that would have been in this segment and would have been in this segment, these green ones. In the beetles, it helped give rise to these hardened back shells, right? And these wings, this is a leafhopper. And some of this specialized segmenting here gave rise to special additional kind of flary structures on things like lace bugs. There is some research showing that it was those segments that were co-opted to turn into the light segments on lightning bugs. Right, so it was this kind of drastic reduction of body parts, leaving behind all of this cellular machinery, really, that was then kind of able to give rise to so many of these different structures. I was wildly excited when I found this figure, because this is actually from the lab I worked in undergrad, but he published it after I came out, and I saw that, and I was like, yeah, go Armin! So, pretty cool. So some of the diversity of insects that we'll see, insects are basically everything, right? If you were to take a look at kind of what the greatest biomass is on the planet, a lot of it's ants, actually, right? There's just so many of them. We think about an elephant, but if you think about like all of the ants, right, piled together, there's a huge amount of diversity in biomass there. And so down here, right, you see us as mammals. We are this like tiny little segment here, and right, imagine that like humans don't even like warrant a pixel, right? It's mostly insects. There are 6 to 10 million species of insects. We really don't know. There are good estimates of how many there are, but there are just so many of them out there that it's hard to know really what's going on. There are about 1 million described. Of those, about 400,000 plus are beetles. So Darwin, before he started working on what would later become Origin of Species, actually did a lot of cataloging of beetles. That was the thing he was really, really into. There's another early biologist, Haldane, who said the creator must have had an inordinate fondness for beetles, right? Like, it's a huge group. Compare that to 390,000 plus species of plants, right? So there are more beetles than plants, all of plants. About 25,000 of the plants are orchids, which is about almost 5 times as many as there are species of mammals, right? So when we think about these kind of lowering groups, this is where most of the action is. These are the little things that run the world. Just as a fun fact, most mammals are bats, or a lot of mammals are bats. Yeah, go ahead.
Just a clarification, that pie chart, is that based on number of individuals or numbers of different?
This is species, right? So if you were to, I would imagine that if you were to do this by biomass, it might actually just be insects, and like everything else was like the other stuff. Great question. And so a lot of us, when we think about insects, if we're gardeners, we just think about like, we're inclined to think about damage. Go ahead.
Just another fun fact.
Oh, I love it.
Aside from diversity,
Yeah.
even though insects are relatively small, the total mass of insects exceeds the total mass of all other creatures combined.
Yeah.
So the insects weigh more than every other kind of animal.
Yeah. Yeah, there's this idea that like if aliens were to come and like kind of like try to look at diversity on the planet, what they would actually get is just like an outline of insects, right? Because that's all you would pick up if you were to scan the earth and be like, what is here? And they'd be like, ants. Mostly ants, right? So.
Right, and that's why they call it the anthropocene.
That's about humans, but yeah, for sure. Yeah, I love it. I would prefer the Anthropocene if it was for ants. But so less than 0.1% of these are actually considered serious pests. The vast majority of these insects are going about doing their insect thing, actively helping the environment as integral players in their ecosystems. And pests are really often just an issue of an imbalance in an ecosystem, right? They take over typically when humans have mucked something up, right? So a little bit of kind of basic insect anatomy and morphology. All insects are, as adults, have 3 body segments: a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. That's non-negotiable. As adults, you have 3 body segments. As an adult, you have 6 legs, 3 pairs of legs. They're always attached to the thorax. If it looks like they're not attached to the thorax, which is that middle segment, look again. They're attached to the thorax, right? And you might need to even pull up a schematic of how that insect actually, like what its anatomy actually is. But they're always attached to the thorax. The wings are also always attached to the thorax. And then all adult insects also have 2 antennae. Sometimes on beetles, they'll be very, very reduced and they'll be club-like. They come in all different forms, but there are always antennae there. And so these rules we have, 6 legs, 3 body parts, 2 antennae, those are really about adults. But a lot of times they apply to juveniles as well. We'll talk about this more when we talk about the hemiptera, but you will often see this. Which you're like, that's 1 body part, maybe 2. Why are you lying to me? Right? What you're actually seeing here again though, right? Remember how they have the ability to evolve all these different forms and all of these different things. What you're seeing here is these outgrowths and you're seeing wings. And if you were to flip that bug over, you would see 3 body parts. Okay? 3 main segments. You also might be like, what about caterpillars? What's going on with caterpillars, right? And the answer is that's not an adult, right? That's the exception, right? So caterpillars, grubs, this kind of stuff, right? It doesn't look like 6 legs and 3 body segments, right? But that's really a juvenile form, and as that thing turns into an adult, it will adopt those adult requirements. Also, because entomologists are tricky, and this is a fun fact, if you were to actually look at this caterpillar, it actually only has 6 true legs. They're hardened, they have a hard exoskeleton, and the things in the back are actually like weird nubby outgrowths, and they're called prolegs. They're not true legs.
Maybe they go to support the body because it's so heavy.
Well, and they can move, right? Because again, remember, these are like those ancestral segments, right? And they have all that machinery to do that. But in an adult, they don't. This is just because it's cool. So the inside of an insect is pretty amazing, and this is what I mean when they're doing things really differently than us. So an insect is small enough that they don't breathe the way we do, right? So we take in air through our lungs and it kind of moves. They actually have spiracles, they have tiny openings throughout the body where they just have kind of passive gas exchange. Instead of having a circulatory system the way we do, they are a tub of goo, right? So they have not blood, they have hemolymph, and their organs are bathed in it. To keep the hemolymph moving and circulating, because you don't want your bathtub of organs to get stagnant, they will often have little pumps, right, kind of here at the legs where they attach that keep everything moving. They'll have a kind of central brain, but they will also have ganglia all down the back that are helping to run the other segments, right? And of course, they have a hard exoskeleton that often helps protect them from the elements, but even then, that armor comes together at certain places, and there are, if you think about like mites on bees, right, there are ways that things can parasitize insects even through that exoskeleton. The amazing thing about this is if you think about all this really, really complicated cellular machinery, and you think about, for example, the size of some of the tiniest insects, to me that always just boggles my mind of how small the organs must be, how small everything must be to fit all of that into a tiny ant or, you know, something really small.
Or like the mites on our eyelashes.
Yeah.
They're invisible.
And they're just like going about their life, right? Doing all this stuff. Insects didn't always used to be small. This is one of the cool things. So higher oxygen levels in the late Paleozoic, so that's about 300 million years ago, meant that the air was denser and insects fit bigger. Dragonfly ancestors especially took advantage of this. So this is Meganura. This is a woman holding a model, so you can see just how big that thing was. So they were taking down salamanders, taking down newts, and it was just because literally the air was heavier due to higher oxygen levels and it could support insects. So they used to be really some of the dominant kind of medium-sized predators, aerial predators.
Even scarier when you think about their kill proficiency.
Yeah, dragonflies are terrifying. They are ruthless killers.
They're the most proficient
Yeah.
predator on
Yeah, dragonflies. So we're saying 95% accuracy on dragonfly kill, and they are actually the only insects that have what we call direct flight, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But it means that their wings are powered by muscles directly connected to the wings, not by like moving the whole thorax. And so it gives them just this extreme agility, and they have adaptations in their front legs just for grabbing things in the air, right? So they can just tear you out of the air, basically.
What's the biggest one now, like 3 inches or something?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, it can't be that much bigger because, I mean, our air will only support so much.
But I'm sorry to ask something.
It's okay.
But do you mean by air supporting, do you mean physically, like if the oxygen is more dense, then it can literally be
Yes.
supported by whereas if the air is too thin, it'll just...
Yeah, exactly right. So the higher oxygen levels meant the air was literally denser, and it could support more things in the air.
like going into a mosh pit with like say 5 people in it, as opposed to diving into a mosh pit with like 8,000.
I could not have put it better.
Thank you.
Okay, we are gonna have time for questions at the end too. I'm just gonna.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, you're good. Okay, so if you think about that in contrast to something like a fruit fly, fruit flies are so small that actually the way they fly is in some ways physically more like swimming through air, right? If you think about some of the smallest insects, air becomes in some ways like a liquid to them because they are operating at such a different scale than we are. And so if you look at the wings of some of the smallest insects, even smaller than fruit flies, they almost look more like single feathers because they're more like oars where they're just kind of, right? Okay. Hopefully I've convinced you insects are cool. You probably didn't need to be convinced. So one of the major distinctions between insects is going to be types of metamorphosis, and this is very important, especially for us when we think about their role in the environment. So first we have gradual or incomplete metamorphosis. Yes?
Can you just talk a little bit slower?
Oh, I will try, but I am from the north.
I know it's hard.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah, so gradual or incomplete metamorphosis. And this is where an insect hatches out. It looks in many ways like a small version of the adult, and it gets bigger, right? It'll go through what we call nymph phases. So you have the egg, and then the nymph comes out, and the nymph might not have wings. The nymph might be missing some other adult structures, but it more or less looks like an adult, right? If you think about that in contrast to something like a maggot does not look like an adult fly. So the nymph slowly gets bigger until it becomes an adult, where it might have wings, it might have other things, but it's just kind of a gradual growing up. Between each one of those steps, the nymph has to molt. Because again, remember that exoskeleton, that hard exoskeleton, okay? So if we think about our cicadas that just came out, and all those skins everywhere, that was the final molt of the nymph stage of the cicada. And so, if you think about it, right, like when you see that skin, aside from the big wings, it kind of looks like a cicada, right? Cicadas are a really notable one where you'll see a lot of this. But they do have to molt in between each stage. Some of the great examples of this, of gradual metamorphosis, will be things like mantises undergo gradual metamorphosis. They come out looking like little mantises, then they look like big mantises. Cockroaches, fun fact, mantises and cockroaches are sister taxa. They are very closely related to each other. And termites are kind of like a specialized case of wood cockroaches, right? That's where they fit. Grasshoppers and katydids are another really notable one. Hemiptera, the bugs, which we will talk a lot about, those are gradual metamorphosis. This is in contrast to complete metamorphosis. This is what we think of oftentimes when we think of insects. So this is where you undergo a radical reimagining of the body plan, right? Gradual metamorphosis, I remember, is kind of what we do, right? So I have, for example, a 5-month-old at home. He doesn't look like me, but you're like, yeah, that's a human, right? Like I can see how that's going to become that. It makes sense, right? These can be something else entirely. So what is happening in complete metamorphosis is you're going from an egg to a larva. This can have a lot of different names. We'll talk about that in a second. To a pupa, which is a prolonged phase where you are in a hard cocoon or puparium, depending on which insect you are. And then you finally emerge as an adult. When this insect enters into the pupal stage, this is not entirely technically accurate, but it's more or less right. It basically melts down its body, save for a couple of specialized areas of stem cells called imaginal discs, rebuilds the body from that, and then emerges here. Right? So if you were to break open this cocoon in an early phase, it would just be like old mayonnaise in there. Right? Like there's no and it's wild, right? Like that's their system. Some examples of this, obviously the butterflies, moths, beetles, flies, ants, bees, and wasps. So a lot of our major groups do this. There is a huge amount of diversity in what these forms can look like across species. So we call them larvae. You might also think of a caterpillar, a grub, a maggot, right? What's a fly larva? A maggot. What's a butterfly larva? A caterpillar, right? We have special names for these, but they're all the larval phase. For example, that is for an ant, right? It looks like a weird, shiny, somewhere between like a grain of rice and a bird poop. I don't know. You have the beetles that live underground, and they're just kind of eating whatever is there. You have highly predatory grub phases for some beetles. This is a ladybug. This is for a mosquito. These things, they actually say, have these kind of like amazing harpoon heads, where the head can actually kind of like grab a little bit extra, which is kind of cool. And then
harpoon head, like it shoots out and shoots back in.
Yeah, there are pictures of it. It's wild, and it doesn't totally make sense to me. Yeah. So you also have a lot of diversity in the pupa chrysalis cocoon phase, right? And so there are different names for this as well, but typically for a butterfly, you're going to hear chrysalis or cocoon. For almost everything else, you're going to hear something like pupa. So for an ant, for example, this is kind of cool. This is what the pupa looks like, but if you were to break that open inside, it actually looks like this. It looks extremely like an ant. That's true for a lot of ants, bees, and wasps. This is a lunamoth, so it's a cocoon that's also wrapped in a leaf to make it extra kind of camouflaged. This is a beetle, where again, it looks very much like the form. If you were to look at it, you can see the legs, you can kind of see all these other structures. And finally, because the mosquito is still very weird, here's a mosquito, and they are one of the ones that are actually still somewhat mobile in the pupa phase. They can still move a little bit. Some butterflies can also actually twitch their cocoons even in the pupa phase, which is crazy because, again, it's like old mayonnaise twitching. But they have just enough musculature along the outside that they can do that, and it's a way to hopefully kind of shock. Like, if you find it, you're like, ooh, right? And you kind of move on. So an example of complete metamorphosis and what this looks like, this is a great one, the parsley worm. You start out as an egg. The first phase, there's some theory here that it's meant to look like bird poop, so that it's kind of something easily overlooked and camouflaged. As it grows up, it gets scarier looking. If you can't look like bird poop, you better look fierce. Finally, you go back again to a somewhat more camouflaged phase. Go into the chrysalis, which is also very well camouflaged, right? If you didn't stop to look at that, that does look like almost like a leaf bud on a twig, right? And finally, you emerge. So this is very common that even across the kind of different developmental stage you're in, you might have different forms. And there is a molt between each one of these. So for an insect undergoing an incomplete metamorphosis, they know they have to molt when the whole skin gets too tight, right? Skin gets too tight, time to molt, time to go up to the next size. These guys know to molt when the head capsule gets too tight. So only specifically right here, this little head capsule has a hard exoskeleton. When that gets too tight, you molt the entire thing. Okay, insects in the ecosystem. Yes?
The incomplete metamorphosis, do they still use an egg?
Yes.
Not live birth or anything?
No. Sometimes it'll like feel like live birth because it'll all kind of pour out all at once, you know what I mean? But yeah, they're still going through an egg. Everybody in the insects is going through an egg. But a lot of times with incomplete metamorphosis, what you'll see is an egg casing that kind of ruptures, and then just like everybody pours out. You know, like when you accidentally disturb a spider egg sac, and all of a sudden you're like, oh my god, spiders! It's that kind of vibe. Yeah. Okay. This is a great, this is spice bush, swallowtail guys like to live on spicebush. They will wrap themselves in the leaves. What you can see here is a little bit of the webbing that would have been used to wrap that guy up. That's the first line of defense. The second line of defense, if that doesn't work, look like a snake, right? Which I always love when that's the impulse is like, a lot of butterflies are like, I'm gonna look like eyes, right? We're like, okay, I love it. So some of the benefits we see from insects kind of to our ecosystems in general, improved soil. This is something I heard you guys talking about just before class. Those cicadas emerging, that was really good soil aeration, right? We have so many more ways for water to enter our soil now, so many more openings. Provide food. We'll talk about that more in a second, but they are a major, major food source. They are pest predators, which for us can be very, very helpful. So a lot of times, like I work with a lot of gardeners and people will freak out because they have aphids. You can either treat the aphids or wait. Because if you don't treat the aphids, the ladybugs will, right? They will come in and kind of rebalance things. Excellent pollinators. They make some delicious food for us. I'm not gonna lie. They make food for everybody else. They also make some food for us. And I would argue just beauty. They add a lot to our environments. And I think that all of us get like a little bit weirdly excited when we see a pretty butterfly, right? So in thinking about the role of insects in the ecosystem, we actually do have to go back to plants because that's really where insects shine. So in a terrestrial ecosystem, so the sort of land ecosystem that we're in, all energy comes from the sun. Plants are producers. They are able to capture sunlight and use it to create sugars and carbohydrates, right? That's the process of photosynthesis. You know about that. Plants are not doing this because they're just like really good neighbors and excited to share, right? They come up with all sorts of defenses to keep those sugars and carbohydrates for themselves. They're actually extremely well defended. We think of, oh, but I eat so many plants. There are so many more plants you do not eat, right? Wander out and just try gnawing on any part of an oak tree. It will be disappointing, right? Because the plant has figured out how to protect itself. And so we have these producers here at the beginning, but then oftentimes our primary consumer, our first order consumer is an insect. The insects have done an extremely good job figuring out how to get over the defenses of the plants, often in very complicated and specialized relationships. They then open up all that energy for our secondary consumers, right? So there are so many more things that eat insects than probably eat plants. If you think about a caterpillar, that is nothing but like a protein snack, right? Very easy, not well defended. Like gummy, right? Like it's so much easier. Tertiary consumers then come along. And if you think about the way this works, and I think we might talk about this more in other classes, from each step, if you have 100 units of energy here, you typically have about 10 units of energy here. You have 1 unit of energy here. You have 1/10 of a unit of energy here. This is why we see so many fewer big predators than we see plants and insects, right? Because this is kind of where so much of the energy is. Because these insects have to use most of that energy for just daily life, right? They might use it for metabolism, they might use it for all these other purposes, and so it's not like it goes directly here, right? Finally, you have your apex predators, and then because this is life, you have your decomposers. And we think about it in a food web like this, this is kind of like a food chain that's not connected, but actually, right, this is what really happens. Everybody eats everything, and in the end, we all are for the decomposers, right? But what's really essential here is to remember that oftentimes insects serve as this first crucial link, getting energy from plants into the rest of the system, right? And so this is something I think it's really helpful to think about as naturalists, as you guys are going about, is that oftentimes we think about individual plants, individual insects, how beautiful that bird is, but so much of ecology is energy flow. How does energy come into the system, and how does energy move through the system? And what impacts that? So one of the reasons we picked insects as one of our very important things to learn about here is because they are so essential for so many other critters, and especially for birds. So 96% of North America's terrestrial birds, so it's land birds, rear their young on insects, not seeds or berries. It does not matter how much bird seed you put out, those songbirds want insects, and they want a lot of them. And what they really want is caterpillars, right? If you give your young an adult insect with all that exoskeleton and all this other weird stuff, right? That's like a lot to deal with, right? If you give your young a caterpillar, very easy, right? Like it's just a very easy food source. A pair of Carolina chickadees brings 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to the nest to rear one clutch of eggs. Oftentimes these birds can rear multiple clutches a season, right? So they are coming and going, coming and going, coming and going, constantly just pulling insects back.
How many eggs would be in a clutch?
I think it's around 3 to 4, but I would double check that. But I mean, it's like your insect to bird ratio is alarming if you're a caterpillar. Insects are also eaten by many small mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and of course each other, right? So they really are powering so many of these systems, and they're breaking things down for us, right? So not only do they make the dinner, they clean it up afterwards, right? Yeah.
Do humans eat like the insects when they're is that an easy source of food, or is it just like
So songbirds aren't looking for that for their young. Oh, so the question was, thank you. Do things eat things in the pupal phase, right? Which makes sense, right? It's this most stationary of all the phases, so like what's not to like? I don't think it's as common for songbirds. They are really, really looking mostly for caterpillars and other soft-bodied things, but they'll take what they can get. But I've never known a thing in nature to pass up a free meal, so I'm sure things are eating that. So for example, this is going to sound far afield. It's coming back, don't worry. I worked at a field station when I was an undergrad where they were studying juncos, ground nesting birds. Which I lost my respect for juncos in this process. They're fine, but like, you're a bird. Go to the tree, go in, go up. They would lay their eggs and they would rear their young in these ground nests. And one of the biggest problems for the researchers with it was that they were being eaten by deer. Right? So you'd like come up to your site and there'd be like a deer standing there and it'd be kind of bloody on the muzzle and it'd be like, hey, you know? And it's because it was very easy. So they would do that. It was free protein. So I find that like in general, most things will eat most things given the option. Yeah.
But the timing is often wrong because people will often sort of overwinter and the caterpillars are in the spring when all the nestlings are.
Yeah, and it would depend on the insect, right? So are you going to have multiple life cycles per year?
Right.
And so you align, or is it one life cycle a year where you don't align? Yeah, that's a good point.
I think house finches do too.
Yeah, and it just depends on kind of everyone's life cycle in there. Okay, so, and this is kind of a real central and important relationship. So we think about insects in relation to plants in terms of eating them, but a lot of what the relationship is about pollination. So flowering plants and insects diversified together during the Cretaceous, like we talked about. And this is a really, really important relationship because for the plants, it allows them to increase their genetic diversity by outcrossing or by mating with others from their species instead of just having a party by themselves. It also allows them to spread their seed further. Because for so many things, that's what the fruiting body is, right? It's a tasty way to spread your seed. The first pollinators were likely beetles and flies, and then later the butterflies and bees really radiated. And so oftentimes what we think of when we think of flowers is we think about things with a flower like an aster or a daisy with a big landing pad that a butterfly can land on. Or that a bee can kind of like try to shove its whole body into because it's so excited to try and get nectar and pollen. One of my favorite things, if you ever notice it, if you see things like mint flowers, even hosta flowers, these long, slender flowers, the largest bees, the sort of carpenter bees, are too big to get in there. And so what you'll see them actually sitting at the base of the flower, cutting a hole in, just to steal the resources, which is kind of pretty clever. But also, so this is the flower of wild ginger. It's down on the ground. It's kind of this dark red color, right? That's pollinated by things like beetles and flies, right? So many of flowers, we don't think about this, but they'll actually have these more rancid scents. And that's to attract beetles and flies. Not to say that a beetle can't have a good time, right, on another flower. But these relationships work really well, and so much of what you'll see, you've probably seen these pictures where it's what a flower looks like under different spectra of light, under UV light, and all of a sudden some of these flowers will light up like landing pads, and that's because insects can see in that range, even if we can't. So there are all these really specialized adaptations that pull insects and plants together, and there are certainly many cases where it's a specific insect that pollinates a specific plant. There's a lot of cases too of this sort of more like what we think of as generalism, where insects will kind of hit many different types of plants. 2/3 of the flowering plants are pollinated by insects, and this is thought to be the more ancestral form. So something like a magnolia, which was a sort of really interesting flower because it's more ancestral, right? The idea there was that basically a beetle would come and like roll around in the pollen, eating some of it, stealing some of it, and rolling some of it onto the next flower. So insects really do a little bit of all of it. I love this picture of a rejuvenated assassin bug basically going to town on like a Colorado beetle. So this is very important for understanding why you have generalists and specialists. And we'll think about that a little bit more later, but I just want to kind of lay this out here, is that plants are extremely well dependent. They have thick cell walls. They might not seem thick to us, but if you are the size of an insect, all of a sudden they're much thicker, right? They have defensive compounds. So many of the things that we find attractive about plants are actually just typically insecticides. Like that's the goal of why they produce them. So if we think about caffeine, nicotine, mustard, peppery flavors, all of those things, those are actually capsaicin in peppers, the spice in peppers. Those are all things that the plant produced to try and get things not to eat it, which was not great for them from a human's perspective, like from how humans use them. But that's really what they are, right? They also have spines, thorns, prickles, anything they can possibly do to defend their resources. But what's really interesting about this is that insects have figured out ways to get around so much of this. But these relationships evolve over time and they can be very intricate. So I love this picture, and it looks like nothing, but it is the coolest thing. So monarchs, right, eat butterfly weed. And why is that important, right? Because butterfly weed is toxic to the vast majority of things. And monarchs and a couple of other insects have figured out how to get around that. So not only have they figured out to eat toxins, they are able to eat those toxins as caterpillars. They're able to store them in their body so that they are then toxic as adults, which is crazy. They're able to kind of advertise that they're toxic. They're able to do all these special things. So they've already gotten around all of these defenses. But the butterfly weed actually has another defense too. It has this really milky sap that if you're a tiny little monarch caterpillar, it can really gum up your mandibles, gum up your mouth parts. It can make it all very, very difficult to eat. So the monarchs have also evolved a behavioral thing they do, where they go to the midvein, they eat the midvein, stops sap flow, and now all of a sudden you can eat up here and none of that sap's gonna flow and gum up your mouth parts. So the monarchs had to evolve not only ways to eat the toxins, sequester the toxins, use the toxins as adults, they had to develop behavioral adaptations to get around the other things that the butterfly weed was trying to do to them, right? And so this is kind of a really stark example, but you'll see this kind of all over the place, where insects know preferentially how to eat some parts of plants and not others, and these are all evolved responses, right? This took a long time. And as they're doing that, the plant is trying to figure out, right, how in the world it can get even one step ahead. So they're in these kind of arms races, which is really interesting. Because of this, you'll often see host specificity, where insects will be evolved to eat certain types of plants and not others because those relationships are so complicated. Most insects, like we talk about with the monarch, milkweed. Said butterfly weed, I meant milkweed, but both are Asclepias. Most insects are on a fairly narrow range. Host specificity can vary between life stages though, right? So if you think about a caterpillar eating leaves versus an adult butterfly eating pollen and nectar, those might be really different, right? A monarch adult can go to any number of different plants, whereas the monarch as a caterpillar is really looking for milkweed or Asclepias. We do have some exceptions called generalists. These aren't quite as common, but they're the ones that can kind of get annoying at times, right? So they are grasshoppers, Japanese beetles, some aphids. They'll eat basically anything, they don't care. But in general, you're looking at a relatively narrow host specificity. And I would argue, even if you think about something like hornworms, if you ever see these on your tomatoes, there's actually a species of tomato hornworm and there's a species of tobacco hornworm. They don't always get the memo which one they are. You often find them on the opposite. But even then, as you might know, tomato and tobacco are very closely related. Yeah, Solanaceae, right? So the caterpillar is still adapted to this relatively narrow range. Predators are our other major generalist. Predators tend to be willing to eat basically anything they can get their hands on for the most part. Which makes a lot of sense, right? Because they don't have to get over necessarily some really intricate defense system from a plant. They just have to grab you. So just as like one of my favorite examples of how complicated this can all get and why I really encourage folks to, it's very tempting to think we understand systems and we can create systems. And even with a lot of good research that helps us understand systems, there's always some sort of like secret sauce that makes these things really complicated. And oftentimes I think as humans, we need to be aware of not over-intervening because we think we know better. So again, we go back to our monarch. One of the really interesting things, as many of you know about monarchs, as we just talked about, is you have this really interesting relationship with milkweed. I was really excited. So this picture was actually taken by my dad. He sent it to me because he was showing me the caterpillar. And then what I noticed was right here, it's that mid-vein shoe, right? Which I was like, that's awesome. I was wildly excited. So in addition to that, though, we have these really interesting migration routes, right? There's so much we don't know about monarchs. Many of these routes were discovered relatively recently. They're doing these massive, massive multi-generation, oftentimes migrations where they're going down to Mexico and California. They're going all around here. We don't even know where they are. We don't know what they're up to. This is relatively a recent discovery, actually. You have the viceroy, right? This is an extra complication to the monarch story. This is not a monarch. This is a viceroy. This is an insect that decided, again, like, give me grace here, you guys. Evolution is not decided. It's just more fun to talk about it that way. This is like a little bit late. So the monarch was toxic as an adult because it's figured out how to sequester toxins when it's feeding. The viceroy is not toxic. It just figured out that because the monarch's toxic, if it looks like the monarch, no one's going to mess with it, right? The problem's solved. So it evolved this really kind of harsh warning coloring to look like the monarch. But that only works if there are fewer viceroys around than monarchs. Because if there are a bunch of viceroys, nobody learns not to eat that, right? And they'll eat everybody. And so it's actually very, very dependent on the frequency of viceroys to monarchs. And one of the ways they figured this out, this is that research you can't do anymore. They got a bunch of blue jays, right? And they would like feed them a viceroy or a monarch and see what happened. And if it was given a monarch, it would eat it, think it was a great idea, wonder what it had done, and throw it up. If you then try to give it a viceroy, it won't touch the viceroy. But if you start this experiment instead with the viceroy, it'll actually eat a couple monarchs before it figures out what's going on, right? And so you have this huge complicated interaction, right, where you have a plant-insect interaction, you have insect-bird interactions, you have migrations, you have all of these different things happening. And then, of course, as humans, we come in and we try to like be very, very helpful by planting additional milkweed. But this is actually a species here that it's called tropical milkweed, Asclepias puricivica. It doesn't have the right ratios of what a caterpillar needs, and it can also bloom a little bit too late in the season. So what happens then is that they hang out on it too long and are not able to make the migration because they started too late.
Wow, how can you tell if you're getting the right ones?
Most of the species you can buy. Yeah, most of the species you can buy here. This one's not as common, but this is kind of a classic thing, right? We come in and we're like, don't worry, I can help. They're like, come on, just like give them more habitat. And that's actually what's useful, right? So we've talked a lot about kind of charismatic insects. A lot of what you're going to see when you see insects is not insects, it's the impact of insects, right? That's much more common actually to find. It's going to be things like marks from feeding, nesting, a little bit of disease. There are some diseases that you'll see on plants that are actually from insects. These are really easy because they just kind of stay put, right? You don't have to find like the beetle scurrying around. And what becomes really important here is actually understanding insect mouthparts. Insect mouthparts in some cases can very strictly help you identify what that insect is, but in general can often help you narrow it down, right? So with flowers, on flowering plants, a lot of times we were like, flowers are a really good diagnostic key. If you can find them, they're really easy. They help you get started. Mouthparts and damage can really help you with insects. So some of the major mouthparts you see are chewing. That's going to be on the beetles. Piercing, sucking mouthparts. You'll hear that phrase, piercing, sucking, piercing, sucking, piercing, sucking. This is always on the hemipterans, the bugs, what we call the true bugs, and their relatives. Siphoning, chewing, lapping. This is going to be things like siphoning, right? That's going to be the proboscis of a butterfly. Chewing and lapping, if you think about how so many of our solitary bees are able to cut those really cool leaf bits out to make their little nests. And then the spongy mouthparts, that's flies, right? You've all seen like a fly land and do its like thing all over the table because it's trying to figure out what's going on. For chewing mouthparts, a lot of times we'll end up seeing leaf feeders. This is going to be things like caterpillars, beetles, both adults and larvae, grasshoppers. Some of the signs you'll see will be chewing marks and holes. Grass, that's our 10-cent word for insect poop, right? Webbing, right? These are the guys who they don't care, they're just there for lunch, right? Like they're not being picky, they're just going to eat all of it.
Is that like tent caterpillars or something?
Yeah.
Does anything eat tent caterpillars?
If you break the tent open, birds will go to town on them.
Oh, okay. So if we break the tents open, then I wouldn't have to have somebody come spray. Just break the tents open, and the birds will eat them.
Typically, that's how it works. Yeah. Yeah, it's a bunch of caterpillars all in one spot. What's not to like? Leaf miners. These are the ones who are somewhat more discerning, right? So they feed between the top and bottom surface of the leaf. These are mesophyll cells. They're a little bit more tender. They're a little bit nicer, right? You don't have to eat through the skin. They don't eat those outer skin or epidermal cells. And so a lot of times you'll see this sort of action, right? Sometimes you'll be able to open it up and there will be almost like a gall formed. And you open it and that's a fly, oftentimes in there, a little maggot. The damage is usually really minor. So even though this might look dramatic, I always actually think it looks really kind of cool and like pretty to see that. The damage is typically not that problematic for the plant and it's totally fine. Skeletonizers are also discerning, but in a different way. They just don't want to eat the veins. They will leave the skeleton of the leaf behind, which is actually pretty cool if you want to understand the vascular system of the plant, right? And all of that tissue, because it's just right there for you. There's nothing to distract you. You have a lace-like appearance. And this can be oftentimes Japanese beetles. This is a lot of times where you'll see this. So it's pretty interesting, but frustrating if it's a plant you like. Some of the other things that chewing mouthparts can do are the borers. These are often beetles. Not always, but often. So beetles and moth larvae, they feed under the bark on stem and wood tissue. Ambrosia beetle is a really interesting one because actually the ambrosia beetle burrows in, creates this little hole, but doesn't actually eat the plant tissue. It brings its own specialized fungus along, lines the tube with that fungus, and that's what its grubs eat. And different species of ambrosia beetle will often have their own fungus. Okay, so some of these, thinking about the borers, just kind of wrapping this up. Oftentimes, it can be hard to see because the holes are very small. Sometimes you'll actually still see a toothpick of sawdust basically poked up behind it if the rain hasn't washed it off yet. Some of the borers will cause basically all-out rapid failure of the plant. So if you've ever tried to grow squash and you've got a squash vine borer, you go out one morning, the entire plant's wilted. You dutifully water it. You go out the next morning, it looks worse. And then if you were to go down to the base of the plant, slit it open, you would see this really fat, happy little grub being like, right? And that's because it ate the entire vasculature, right? The entire connective vasculature. Piercing, sucking mouth parts. These are the hemipterans. What they're doing is they have this mouth part, and it is exactly what it sounds like. It pierces and then it sucks, right? And so, however it does that, it's on plants. It's typically plants and other insects. They're typically extracting fluids, right? So on plants, a lot of times you will see discoloration. This means they were removing only the cells that had chlorophyll in them. Those were the cells they were looking for. So kind of like this, we often call it, it's very similar to, stippling damage, like what you would see down here. You might see this on plants every once in a while where it looks like someone almost took a paintbrush with a light color and just, right? And that's because this has all been basically pierced and sucked, and they've taken out all of that chlorophyll-containing tissue. You'll oftentimes also see distortion. This is something you'll often see with aphids because they've removed so much of the vascular fluid as those tissues are trying to develop that they simply can't expand and grow right? So if you get a young leaf with a lot of aphids or other piercing, sucking insects on it, they basically just shrivel it, right? And it never expands properly. You can also see that kind of stippling damage sometimes on fruit and other things. Another thing you see commonly with these guys, which is really, really interesting, is honeydew and sooty mold. So you might have seen this before. So honeydew is because aphids is one of the major insects that do this. They feed on the phloem, so they feed on that vascular sap that contains basically like the food and nutrients of the plant. But what's going on is that they want protein and sugar, but there's more sugar in that phloem than protein. So they have to keep pulling phloem. They have to keep going until they have as much protein as they want. And then it's too much sugar, right? So they just put the sugar at the back end, right? And that's what honeydew is. It's a sticky substance. You'll find it all over some plants. It's just kind of weird. And what that means is that there's an insect somewhere above that going to town, putting sugar at the back end, right? It can often attract ants and wasps, so other things show up because they like it, which is actually pretty good, right? It's a free meal for them. It's just like sugar water being left out. But it can also encourage sooty mold, which you will see this sometimes too, which is this black mold. And you can tell when it's sooty mold because if I were to take my nail and rake that leaf, I could get the sooty mold right off. And the sooty mold is just growing on all that sugar. So if I ever see sooty mold, what I know is there's an aphid or something similar to an aphid, maybe a scale insect, something like that somewhere around, typically somewhere higher up. This can be harming the plant because it can block sunlight from getting to those leaves. You also can see egg laying. So this is pretty cool, actually. This is a really crazy thing. So gall-forming insects, what's going on with the gall-forming insects is that they have figured out a way basically to tap into the cellular machinery of the plant to coerce the plant to make something like almost like a cancerous growth, but adapted for that insect, right? So they were able to come in and get the plant to form these different sorts of galls, and typically you'll find an egg right in the middle, and it's been surrounded by specialized plant tissue that they've been able to basically encourage to grow, which is super cool. Twig girdlers are another thing you'll commonly see. Twig girdlers, many types of beetles, want to lay their eggs in freshly fallen twigs. So they may freshly fallen twigs. Right? Just go through, cut it off, and there'll be eggs in that broken portion. They typically are not causing serious damage, so even though you might see a tree dropping twigs because of this, the tree's fine, right? There is kind of this balance. A good, healthy growing tree out in the environment can handle some of this, right? In general, whenever you see insects, disease, whenever you see anything like that really being pronounced, it's often because the plant itself had some sort of underlying problem, right, that made it more susceptible. Insects can pick up on the stress pheromones of plants. They can know which ones to attack, which ones are the easiest meals. But that meant they had to be susceptible for another reason, right? Finally, disease transmission, just because this is kind of cool. If you're going around piercing, sucking, all these different things, right, you are basically a needle going from one to the next next, and that can cause disease transmission. About 200 plant diseases, and this is more in ornamental plants, but this is also true in some of the environments that we'll see that are spread by insect vectors, mostly viruses, some bacteria, some fungi. They're either spread directly by feeding, like what I was saying, or by wounding, right? So when the insects go in and eat, they're opening up all these wounds. If the plant is getting a lot of insect damage because it was already susceptible, and now it has a lot of open wounds, right? You can kind of be in this cascade of declining health. All right, getting to know the neighbors. Let's talk about some different insects. So, insects, just like plants and just like everything else, are organized, right? They're organized using that same system that we've learned about before with binomial nomenclature. Sometimes these things shift around for sure. They don't shift quite as much as the plants. The plants are kind of notorious for shifting where things are categorized, but insects do that to some degree. They're most coherently organized by order. So for a lot of plants, we would think about things at the family level. For insects, it's often very helpful to think about at the order level, a little bit higher up. Orders often end in patera, depending on what the letters are around it. It's the Greek word for wing, and it describes the wing anatomy. So many plants we think of as being of the flowering plants we think of as being organized by their flowers. Insects are often organized by their wings. I'm going to give you a highlight of just some of the most common orders you're going to see, and we're going to learn about a little bit in the activities. Coleoptera, right? Beetles. The main action, most things are beetles, right? As we learned earlier. So they're the largest group of insects, 300,000 plus worldwide, 24,000 plus in North America. That's identified, right? There's more than that. They're 1/3 of animal diversity, right? So if you're talking about an animal, on average, you might be talking about a beetle. They undergo complete metamorphosis, again, going through that grub phase, but even then there's a lot of diversity in what their grubs might look like. You can have something like a scarab beetle grub that lives underground, or a highly predatory grub that's very mobile and taking down other insects. They have chewing mouth parts. They can be either herbivorous or predaceous. A lot of the really impressive ones are predaceous, but in general, a lot of them are actually herbivorous, right? But if you have ever seen like a picture of a beetle head up close,
Yeah.
I am always very grateful that they're as small as they are. 2 pairs of wings. And this is really what makes a beetle. So most insects, if they have wings, they have 2 pairs of wings. That's most, right? In the beetles, 1 pair of wings has been modified into this very, very hard set of wings called the elytra that protect the flight wings. So if you've seen a beetle fly, a lot of times they fly a little bit like a potato, right? Like they're kind of like they're not super graceful, but they're getting it done, right? And that's because they've sacrificed this set of wings here for protection, right? That's how it's easier for them to go underground. That's how it's easier for them to go into all these different habitats, because their wings are protected, right? They give up a little bit of flight, but whatever, it all works out. So a lot of times if you see this hard, shiny outer pair of wings, you're looking at a beetle. The grubs are often underground and the adults will fly around. Not all grubs are underground though. Again, we do have some very specialized predatory grubs. So what are we thinking about here? If we think about like a Carolina tiger beetle, which is beautiful. I mean, that's just gorgeous. But also if that were like the size of like a Honda Accord, I'd be very concerned, right? Predatory grub phase, in contrast to something like a Japanese beetle, which has a grub phase that lives underground. And as much as we might be annoyed about that, they actually are doing a really good job aerating the soil, right? Because as they're moving through that soil, they're doing all of that work. Something like an ambrosia beetle, which lives in a tree. And here's where you can see kind of, here's the hole, hard to see, but here's that little toothpick of sawdust coming out of the hole that was pushed out. Here's the little chamber inside full of grubs that's been populated with the specialized fungus. Our next major order, Lepidoptera. These are the butterflies and moths. Good thing to know, We think of moths as being kind of like night butterflies. It's actually more like butterflies are day moths. Most things in the Lepidoptera are moths. Butterflies are kind of this interesting exception. There's 180,000 plus species worldwide, about 11,000 species in North America. Again, undergo complete metamorphosis. Caterpillars can look all sorts of crazy ways. If you see a caterpillar that looks almost like a mop head, it is extremely furry. Don't touch it until you know what it is, right? There are some of them around here that can be pretty painful to the touch.
With like a tussock moth.
Exactly right.
I saw one in London.
Yeah, they're pretty cool. I mean, so know what you're looking at. The hairier the caterpillar, the more confident you should be in your ID, right? Before you try to like get in its business. So for mouth parts, we have chewing mouth parts again for the larvae, for the caterpillars, but for adults, we've gone into these proboscis, that's coiled sucking mouth part, right? Think about the long kind of mouth part of a butterfly, or sometimes no mouth parts. Some of the fattest bodied moths, especially, are thought of as gonads with wings. They do not mate or they do not eat as adults. Their goal is to mate and move on, right? So there actually are some cases where the adults just don't have mouth parts. It's not part of that life stage for them.
Is that true for the cicadas that are out right now? Aren't they just out?
They're out mating predominantly, but they do still have mouth parts.
Oh.
Yeah. So they have two pairs of wings as well. They don't have any hardening or protection. They're very, very delicate, but they are covered in these tiny, tiny scales. That's why they say to never touch a butterfly or moth unless you really have to help it or something, because you'll see them almost come off on your hand. Right? They have these very delicate wings. The scales are really helpful for color, flight, and even some amount of thermoregulation, so some amount of body temperature regulation. Just a cool sidebar, not a butterfly that lives around here. If you've ever seen a picture of a blue morpho butterfly, they're the beautiful blue iridescent tropical butterflies. That is not that color because of pigment. That is structural color. So if you think about, what does that mean? Remember how on the back of a CD you would do this and it would flash colors? It's because it had all this different stuff going on. That blue is actually something that is only that way, not because there's a pigment there, but because of the structure there. Flashes blue, which is kind of crazy, right? Like it's not like you could crush it up and get blue out. You would crush it up and it would be nothing, right? Like it would be no color, basically. Flies, Diptera. So, Diptera, Diptera, 2 wings. Remember how we said typically if you're a flyer, you have 2 pairs of wings? These guys have 1 pair of wings. And it's because the second pair of wings has been modified into these very specialized little rudder structures. They're called halteres, but it's why the flies are excellent flyers. Because they have really good wings, but then they also have like special little, like, if you imagine like on an airplane or a helicopter or something, right? Like little like, that help them like even more carefully navigate. About 155,000 species worldwide undergo complete metamorphosis. They can have piercing, sucking, or lapping and sucking mouth parts. A lot of times it's a lapping, sucking mouth part. They have 1 pair of full wings, and the halteres help with flight. And many are mimics. And specifically, they tend to be mimics of bees and wasps, right? So this is a large bee fly. It's a fly, it's not a bee, right? And so a lot of times they will be mimics, especially some of our solitary bees and wasps. Hymenoptera, the ants, bees, and wasps, all very closely related. 150,000 species worldwide, over 500 species of bee here in North Carolina. We all think about honeybees. Most of honeybees are escaped livestock. They are escaped European livestock, right?
Question, why did you include it on the first slide? Because you were talking about honeybees as like a food source. Like, yeah, if you're not in North America.
Or in Europe, or a lot of the world, because they are livestock. Because, I mean, that is a big thing they do, and they are major players in our ecosystems, right? Like, whether we like it or not, they are massive players in our ecosystems, and like honeybees especially are massive economic players. They pollinate so many of our things. Yeah. Honeybees were brought here to do a job. You know, like they were brought here, like sheep were brought here for wool. Honeybees were brought here for honey. You know, like, and so, well, some species of sheep were brought here for wool. So, yeah, over 500 species of native bees here in North Carolina. Many of them are solitary bees. That's very common. Yeah.
What is the purpose of the stinging part if it kills the bee at the end? What's that for?
Okay, so and I'm going to try and go through this kind of quickly, but stinging makes a lot of sense. If you're a solitary bee, those bees actually really don't like to sting. You have to like really push a solitary bee to want to sting you, and a lot of times it doesn't actually kill the bee, but it's still very dangerous for the bee, right? In the same way that like as much as we hate copperheads, for a copperhead to want to bite you, it's coming closer to you. It has to be terrified to want to do that, right? Because for it to want to get closer to the thing that scares it, it has to really be in kind of dire straits. So for many of the bees, they don't die and they don't try to do it. When we think about the bees that are killed by stinging, those are the highly, 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 what we call eusocial bees, truly social bees, things like honeybees. Those honeybees, you can think of them as individuals, you could think of them as many heads of the same organism. They are so closely related and so working toward the same cause. Most of them are not reproductive. Their whole goal in life is just like for the good of the colony, right? And so if I have to die for the good of the colony, that's what I was here for. I don't care. I'm not reproducing. Like, this is how I go out, right? They have biting or biting-sucking mouth parts. They can also have chewing mouth parts as necessary for things like collecting leaf matter. Oftentimes they need that for building their solitary nests. They have 2 pairs of wings. And they range from truly social, what we think of as eusocial, like the honeybees and some wasps and ants, many ants, to extremely solitary, right? There are solitary ants, there are solitary bees, there are solitary wasps. And everything in between. Small colonies, big colonies, all sorts of different adaptations. And one of the things that's really notable about all the Hymenoptera is that they typically have these very, very pinched waists, right? So like, it is not hard to differentiate the difference between the thorax and the abdomen on one of these guys. Hemiptera are tricky, so we're going to spend an extra slide on them. About 80,000 species worldwide. They undergo gradual metamorphosis. Some, like aphids, are able to reproduce asexually, which is kind of awesome if you're a gardener, right? You don't even need 2 aphids, you just need 1. Piercing, sucking mouth parts, the mark of the Hemiptera, right? So Hemiptera is a huge group. It's going to be true bugs, which we'll talk about in a second, aphids, whiteflies, scales, cicadas, any number of different things. They can look very different from each other. They can be doing very different things, but they all have piercing, sucking mouth parts. 2 pairs of wings. Some, though, are wingless. Some have an immobile set of outer wings, right? So this insect here, these are the outer wings, and they're actually very hard for them to move anymore. Okay, Hemiptera. Hemiptera can look all sorts of different ways. I'm going to try and give you some ways to think about Hemiptera, okay? There are some weird Hemiptera, just keep them in mind. I don't have a great way to remember them, just remember that they're there, okay? That's going to be things like aphids and scales. Scales are the wild insects that, let's see, we have them here. It might just look like a wart on the tree. It might look like a dartwort. It might look like a cottony wort. It might look like that. You might not see any insect parts. You might not know what's going on with it. There's an insect in the middle of that thing, right? That's a scale. Aphids and scales, they're just our weirdos. Okay, remember that they exist, set them aside. A lot of what you also have then is you have leafhoppers, right? And so this is where that outer set of wings became very, very specialized and very interesting. And a lot of times they will look like thorns, they'll look like prickles, they'll look like other things. But again, they have piercing, sucking mouth parts. We have cicadas, right? Both annual and the sort of special like 13 or 17-year ones like we have this year. We have a number of different types of water bug. Okay? What you'll see, though, that we're getting into with some of these guys, not all of them, but this is where Hemiptera throw people off, is you can't really clearly see the body parts anymore. Okay? See how the structures are getting interesting. So this is a water bug. Another thing in this group that I don't know if I have a picture of. What is an annoying, piercing, sucking insect that you hope to never have in your house? That's a fly, though.
Scorpion.
Smaller.
Chipmunk.
Bed bugs. Bed bugs pierce and suck you, and that's why you don't like them, right? So a bed bug will look like this, but even smaller. There are also bat bugs, which look very similar, and pierce and suck bats. What?
Are they good for this water?
Yes. Yes. Bed bugs. Okay? Some of them, like this guy here, piercing, sucking, but goes for other insects. He's a predator. And so what you'll run into is you'll run into a lot of this sort of shape where if you look at it from the top, you can't really clearly see all the body parts. Oftentimes that means you're looking at a hemipteran. Okay? Over here, we're starting to get more into what we call the true bugs. This is just a special group of these. For an entomologist, a bug actually means a very specific subgroup. And we were talking about this as we were going over activities. I like to think of it as the shoulder pad look, right? We call these also shield bugs. They're in this group called the Pentatomidae because it's 5 sides. Okay? So a lot of times if you see, let's see, too much shoulder in whatever sense, if you see a body form that you can't quite see, but the wings aren't shiny and hard like a beetle's. It doesn't look like a beetle, but it doesn't look right. A lot of times you're in hemipteran, okay? This is a big group. If you're confused by them, yes.
But what does hemiptera translate to? Like half a wing or?
Yeah, it's because sometimes those wings are immobile or in different forms.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And our last order that we're going to go over really quickly, the Odonata. These are dragonflies and damselflies. I included these because they're really interesting in that they go from an aquatic to a terrestrial life phase, and for some other reasons they can be really helpful as ecosystem indicators. So we have 6,300 species worldwide. They undergo gradual metamorphosis. This is also really helpful to know. So this is the nymph or naiad. It's an aquatic phase. Even though it doesn't have wings, it's similar. And this is a gradual metamorphosis and this is important to know, right? It's not that complete metamorphosis means you go from like caterpillar to butterfly, and gradual metamorphosis means you perfectly look like everything the same, right? This doesn't look entirely like the adult. But as it grows from stage to stage, it simply starts growing out those adult structures. It never goes through a complete metamorphosis stage. It never goes through a pupa or a cocoon. They're the only order with direct flight. Like we talked about earlier, the muscles are directly attached to the wings, making them vicious predators. They are excellent flyers. I mean, if you watch dragonfly whip around a pond, it's just like aerial acrobatics, right? And then dragonflies are generally larger and they hold their wings flat, like this, at rest. Damselflies tend to be more delicate and hold their wings like this, right? So we have a dragonfly and a damselfly, but they're closely related. Perfect. Okay, so learning to live together. This is a great one. I always love this, that we have so many insects, or so many cases where things like ants farm, especially hemipterans. They tend to farm aphids, right? And they'll be very, very good little farmers, right? They'll move the aphids to the underside of the leaf when the rain is coming. They'll do everything they need to take care of them. And that's because, remember, aphids shoot out that sugar? It's like cattle, right? Like, what's not to like? So this is kind of where the conversation with insects tends to go when we talk about them. People have read some article like this, The Insect Apocalypse, right? This was an article that came out a number of years ago in the New York Times. Very, very flashy, where they had done a study basically, and they showed that all of these different insect orders are declining. Everywhere you look, insects are declining. And if we think about them, right, in that crucial early role in food webs, that's a big problem, right? I loved, this article came out, and then a counter article came out. Is the insect apocalypse really upon us, right? which they quoted an entomologist from NC State that we're going to learn from later in this series, Elsie Youngstead. This they thought was a compelling counterargument. They're the most diverse group of organisms on the planet. Some of them will make it. I was like, I don't find that as heartening as you do. Right? We do actually really see evidence of decline across any number of different orders. So this is from one of the publications that kind of helped spur some of that. It came out in 2014. What they were doing here is they were looking at, if you look at a whole bunch of different studies, if you pull the data from a whole bunch of different studies and look at decline across orders. So this is Coleoptera, Hymenoptera, Lepidoptera, Odonata, and Orthopteras, grasshoppers, that kind of stuff. You'll see that most of the data is this red decreasing. Some studies show increasing, and some studies show stable. But for most of these, they can find studies, and a good number of studies that show decreasing levels, right? So either decreasing abundance, diversity, whatever it might be, right? The insect populations are going down. And unfortunately, what's really seems to be being hit is things like grasshoppers, katydids, that kind of stuff.
What is that? Why are they more effective than others?
They're generalists, and they're major crop pests.
So people are killing them?
Yeah. So if we look at kind of a global look at insect abundance, right? The way you read this graph, right? So 1970 to 2010, and this is kind of an index of how many insects there are, right? So it's an index they created for the study. And what we find is that if you look across the insects from 1970 to 2010, all invertebrates have decreased, right? Globally. Lepidoptera especially, right? So our butterflies and our moths especially, they pulled out and found that they're kind of an outlier. That they have gone down, although, sorry, not especially, not as bad, right? So they are problematic, but it's kind of everybody else is even worse. Part of this might be due to the fact that, very frankly, they're charismatic, right? It's like how, like, I'm not anti-polar bear. I'm just saying there are other things to say beyond polar bears, right?
People don't spray for butterflies.
But they do spray for some caterpillars.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
What is the vertical axis on that chart?
The vertical axis here is an index that they made for the study. It's a global index, so I don't know exactly what these numbers correspond to, but if you can imagine that.
So it's an arbitrary number.
Yes, that they needed to. Yeah.
I would think that the short amount of time on the horizontal axis really shows us how fast this is happening.
Yeah, and we'll talk for a minute about that axis too. So average decline of over 45% across observed insect populations. So a lot of times people talk about this as the windshield effect. So if you went driving in the 1970s versus driving now, how dirty is your windshield? Right? A lot less dirty now. And this is why this is crucial, right? They are serving as that first necessary run to get so much of this energy into the rest of our ecosystem and into the rest of our organisms. When we think about why this decline is happening, this is kind of an interesting case study on monarchs from a former colleague, where what they wanted to understand was monarch numbers are going down. Why are monarch numbers going down? It's one thing to say, like, here's what I think the story is. That's great. A lot of times that's very useful. It's better to go and look at the data and say, like, what is the story actually? Like, what is the data showing us the story is? So here we have, on this axis, 1900 to 2000, right? So these are our years. And here we're looking at relative abundance. And we're looking at monarchs here and milkweed here, right? So starting in 2000, there was a really big concern that maybe it was GMOs in crops. Maybe that was the big problem. So they marked the 2000 point. 50% of cropland is in some sort of high yield GMO. Okay, and you see milkweed here and monarchs at this relative abundance. But actually, the monarch decline began much earlier, right? So right after 1950, you see higher levels of milkweed and higher levels of monarchs. So even though we want to say, oh, this is really problematic, you're actually just continuing a trend that was already going on, right? So what's actually driving our milkweed decline? If we back it up to just before 1950, we see that's where we have the inflection in milkweed. Milkweed is at relatively stable levels. Milkweed starts going down. Just after that, milkweed monarchs start going down. What's killing monarchs? Habitat loss, a lack of milkweed, right? Looking more broadly at insects, this is what the research shows. Causes of decline are habitat destruction and degradation, right? This is what we're here about, right? Is how do we help this? Pollution, including pesticides. It's a helpful thing to think about, even how different insects might be exposed to pollution at different times in their life. A caterpillar eating leaves is exposed differently than a butterfly eating pollen or sucking nectar. Biological factors, which was kind of a catch-all for like all the things that were hard to catch. And ultimately climate change was another one they identified, right? But in my mind, climate change is kind of the longer arc of what we're seeing here, right? So this is kind of more acute human-caused habitat destruction. This is longer term, very frankly, human-caused habitat destruction, right? So how can we help? What can we do? This is a good start. Good job, you guys. Just being here.
Later, maybe we can
Yeah.
talk about the colonies on Palm
Yeah.
Beach National Park.
Definitely. Yeah, and so before we dive into this, just because anyone who talks to me about this like one-on-one is like, I want to be like, let's talk about urban landscapes.
Yes.
Okay, because we think of urban landscapes, and oftentimes I think we come in with this impulse, which is very, very nice, that we're going to take this back to what it was, right? Or we are going to let nature run its course, or somehow nature is going to solve this if just we let it. And that's true. It will in a very long arc. But when we're thinking about urban landscapes, we are thinking about highly, highly, highly modified landscapes. The soil structure is not the same. Water movement is not the same. We've come in and we've overlaid this very heavy hand on it. The climate might even be, you have microclimates, you have other things going on that are different than what they were. And so I would argue that because humans have already had such a heavy hand here, we should expect to continue to have a heavy hand. These things can't just solve themselves, because if we let them try to solve themselves, we're actually just going to have a field of wisteria, right? If we have anything. So it's okay to say, I need to come in, I need to take an intervention, because we've already done that so heavily to these landscapes. And I'll take that a step further and I'll say, as you move into these landscapes that are outside of urban landscapes, but that like many of us will be doing our projects in and working in, even if they look natural now, a lot of times they were former farmland, there is a huge history of human impact there. And as much as earlier in the talk, I cautioned against thinking we know exactly what to do, right, with the butterfly milkweed, right, that was not the right species. You have to figure out how to strike your balance between being respectful of the system, knowing that you don't understand it, and also being willing to make choices that you think are the right choice, because there's a responsibility to repair, right? And I think that if we do a good job at kind of balancing those impulses, to respect the system, but also to repair the system, that's how you get it far enough along that then nature can take its course, right? But it's going to take us a minute to get there. I'm just saying that because a lot of times people come into these conversations on urban landscapes and they're like, don't do anything, I'll figure it out. And you're like, you already did a lot. So most of us, I think, are already, we know to move away from this notion of pest-free, right? Yeah, and more pedaling. Well, these were wildly attractive for folks that didn't want a bunch of bug bites on their plants, right? Like, there's a reason this happened. Pretty berries and weird, and the bugs don't eat it. You're like, why don't the bugs eat it, right? So most of us already know, let's move away from this notion of pest-free, right? Actually, how do you know that your milkweed was a success? It's been eaten, right? It looks like hell, right? Like, success. The system works. And so increasingly we want to move to these systems where we have so many native plants and pollinators. This is a thing where I will caution you that especially in highly urban settings and where we're thinking about highly human impacted settings, we need to think about what native means. Our climate is changing. The whole thing is changing. So does urban mean it historically occurred in Durham County? Does urban mean it does well on Piedmont soils? Right? Ranges are changing. Everything's changing, and you need to think about what your goals are, right? So as you build out these systems, you want to include so many different types of plants. But I would say personally, I believe in a certain more generous approach to native that maybe means native on Piedmont soils, native in this area, right? Not this sort of puritanical approach to it, which like some people love that. And like Gold Star, I love it if you can make that garden work. But as climate changes, especially when we think about trees, we might need to be looking at varieties that historically have done better a little bit further south. Yeah.
This is kind of a specific question, but you mentioned other types of plants. On echinacea, a lot of time, we've got purpura here, we've got purple coneflower, we've got the green coneflower. We have a lot of native coneflowers, pallida. So the kind that you get from, say, Home Depot, this sombrero that's sold in a lot of the nurseries, does that cut down on the life cycle, the stages, like only the adults eat it, but it doesn't support the larva, or how do those two compare?
Can I talk about that in a second?
Yes.
Specifically on echinacea?
Species,
Yeah, okay.
it's like a
We'll talk about this in a second. Good question. These are just fun. The native insects fight back, right? This is a picture of a native rejuvenated, piercing and sucking as is its wont, a European honeybee, right? Like this little guy figured out how to sit right on the edge of the beehive and just pull them off as they were coming in, which I really liked. So when we think about our natives, and this is something to think about, and this kind of goes to your question, and we'll get actually even to echinacea very specifically, we want to make sure that we're picking varieties that sometimes there's a value to picking a cultivars, to picking something that was bred, and sometimes there's a real value to picking what we call the straight species, the wild type, right? I like a straight species myself often because there's greater genetic diversity. That's a slightly separate conversation, but that's a good reason to do it. But also because when we think about some of these really highly selected plants, echinaceas, this is an example of a rus, a sumac, that has been bred to have purple leaves. Purple coloration is often actually an insect defense, right? That's a stress compound that the plants put out, and so purple leaves are oftentimes harder to eat. Just a fun thing to know. On these, this thing is such a mess at this point that the insects can't even figure out how to get into it, oftentimes. And oftentimes the rewards are not as great. The pollen and the nectar have been decreased because the plant had to find the energy to make these extra frilly bits.
At one point, we asked yourself, why not just pick a whole nother flower?
Yeah.
Pick a flower that already looks like that.
Right.
If I was a plant breeder and I made that, I would like want a gold star. Like I like that's pretty, but like that's not what we're talking about. Like I actually think there's value for pretty, and if you want one of these in your yard, but you're gonna surround them with a lot more of that, be like have your pet plant. Have it. Just have most of them useful, right? So this is kind of what some of that could look like instead. So echinacea, let's talk about it. So if you want to see some of this data more firsthand, I would absolutely look at the Mount Cuba Center trials. These are really, really interesting. They will oftentimes do a deep dive into a species or set of species to look at how those plants perform for pollinator impact. I think they basically send a bunch of grad students out, sit them in front of flowers. They're like, count the pollinator visits. Come back when you're done, right? And they get really good data that way. So this is kind of an example of how they do that. This is from their echinacea study. This graph is going to be too small for you to see. You don't need to see it. I'm trying to illustrate a point. If you want to see it, I encourage you to look it up. So what are they doing here? This is a whole bunch of species and cultivars. Different types of echinacea. Some of them are species. Some of them are bred. This is pollinator visits. Okay? The ones down here in this darker color are double flowers. Okay? You will notice they are all clustered down here at the low end of pollinator visits. That's what a double flower gets you. gets you not many pollinator visits.
Well, where do they live? There's no landing strip. Where's
Yeah,
that cone of
yeah.
seeds that the goldfinches eat in the winter?
Although I will say, interestingly enough, the straight species Echinacea purpureum is the second highest performer for pollinator visits. It's actually beat by a cultivar.
Which is the cultivar?
I will look it up and let you know, because as soon as that came out of my mouth, I was like, but that's just to know. And oftentimes also what will happen, right, is you might have a cultivar that is a better grower on your site than the straight species would have been. And this is where I say practice good judgment, right? Because it doesn't matter how much you wanted Echinacea purpureum if it's going to die every single time. And if a cultivar that could have handled your harsh site will survive a little bit better, right? What is better, the hypothetical straight species or the actual plant growing there, right? So these are the double flower situations.
Oh. Looks like a bird.
And so the other thing I'll say that's kind of interesting that I loved about this is these arrows point to straight species. So this down here is actually Tennesseeansis, Echinacea tennesseeansis, which is one they looked at in their trial. It is outperformed by any number of cultivars. So just because you picked a straight species does not mean it gets the most pollinator visits.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
That species is actually located its native range is very, very small and basically
Tennesseeansis is like kind of specific that way, but I'm saying this one also though, I'd have to look at which one this is, but this is not Tennesseeansis. And it's still, and all of that is I'm just trying to say like balance a little bit what your goals are. And if you spend too much of your life researching, I know this personally, you get so bogged down in the details that it's a mess. So maybe don't do that. But if you want to look at one of these charts and make some decisions based on that, you might end up picking a cultivar instead of a straight species because it fits your needs better. And that's okay too, because we are already in highly, highly, highly impacted environments. Yeah.
So do all of those support both the nectar and the pollen, or some of them nectar, some of them?
And for this, they're specifically looking at pollinator visits. So it's not clear what that pollinator might be going for in this graph per se. But I would argue that it's probably, they're getting something out of it, right? Like they're not going to keep going back if, yeah.
And the other thing is, they might be getting the most pollinators, but are some pollinators, you know, that thing from like 1984, are some pollinators more equal than others? And the other thing is, one of the reasons
Animal
farm, yeah, that's it. Are my coneflowers are always visited, and this is when I lived in New Jersey too, by goldfinches. They just love those seeds, and they.
Right, and so that's the complexity here, right? Like they're looking at pollinators, they're not looking at birds pulling seeds at the end of the season.
So, I mean, that might be a beneficial factor for some types of birds that in the winter like to have those seeds. That's why I don't cut anything down, you know, as we all know, because.
And so absolutely, all of this is to say, just know about yourself the level of research you want to do. Don't get bogged down. At some point, you're going to need to make a choice, and that's okay. Like you did your best, right? There's a lot of factors here. But it is interesting to know in these Mount Cuba trials what wins and what doesn't. And importantly, I would actually argue you can pull out broad trends. Don't go double flowers, don't go purple leaves. Unless it's really pretty and it's your pet plant.
And quantity is important.
Yes.
Getting 5 of anything on that chart is better than getting 1 of anything on that chart.
Exactly right. And that's because of how pollinators find their flowers, right? Oftentimes they find something they like, they look for it again. Okay. We're gonna go through the next part quickly. So revisiting host specificity. Most insects feed on a relatively narrow range of plants, and host specificity can vary between life stages. There are, however, plants that tend to support more insects. So native oaks, as many of us know, are excellent supporters. We do not all have room for a native oak. Not all projects have room for a native oak. Not all people have room for a native oak. It's okay. So luckily, blueberries are native and actually also support a lot, and they're delicious. Goldenrod, sunflower, thinking about planting across seasons. So a lot of you have probably already seen this, but just to make sure for everyone who hasn't, I'm about to show you a chart that, again, I'm trying to show you that it exists. I'm not trying to show you every piece of data on it. So New Hope Bird Alliance puts out the most amazing plant lists for the area. They are organized both by type of plant and also by kind of highest impact. So if I were to look at one of those plant lists like this from New Hope, they have the common name, scientific name, plant facts. I like to think of them, you know, like, do I want this plant? And then what's really, really interesting is they also have benefit to wildlife. And it'll be like a nectar host, larval host, kind of what life stages are they impacting, right? And so helpfully, I can go through and I can look at this, and if I want a tree or a perennial, I can go to the tree section, I can go to the perennial section, I can pick out what I want, right? That's one way you can do it. So, but they also organize it just by highest impact. There is a way to just pull these lists so that you are just going to say, wow, look at that. These native oaks might support 488 different species. You don't have to plant the oak just because it supports the most. Like, it's okay, I give you permission to look a little bit further down the list and pick one that actually fits your site, right, that will actually live and that you might like. And what's really helpful about this is that oftentimes, and this is something that's helpful to communicate to the public too, oftentimes we get hung up on monarchs and milkweed, myself included, and we think, I should plant milkweed for the monarchs. Milkweed for the monarchs. Like, milkweed supports monarchs and milkweed bug. Right? Is that what you should be planting, or should you be planting something like a blueberry that's going to support tens to hundreds of species? Right? Or one of these generalists that supports more. If I have space for, if what's in your heart is milkweed and that's going to make you happy, I'd rather have milkweed than nothing. Like, Godspeed. I love that for you. Right? But if you're open, think about some of these other things. You also want to make sure you're planting across all seasons. You need blooms the entire time, right? So you don't just need to support the caterpillars, you need to support the adults. You need to support every life stage, and that's how you get the most bang for your buck. Debbie Roos from Chatham County has some really excellent lists. These are great to share with the public. Top 25 pollinator plants, spring blooming, summer blooming, fall blooming. Pick 2 to 3 from each section, plant. You have done a good thing, right? You have across the, and she's picked these plants specifically because they do well. And if you give this list to even someone with maybe not a black thumb, but a brown thumb, they can probably make it work, right? A couple more resources that you might be interested in. I would especially encourage you, if you have not looked at the North Carolina Extension Gardener Plant Toolbox, to check this out. This is a wonderful resource, and it allows you to plug in things all about your site to then pull up native plants. Remember, if you're planting a native plant that's well suited for your site, you're going to be supporting insects, you're going to be supporting everybody else. Additionally, we'll learn about this, I imagine, a little bit with birds. There's some things you can do to make it extra inviting, right? Extra enticing. Sometimes you'll see insect houses. These are cute, they're fine. They're also like really good for, especially bee parasites. If you put all your solitary bees in the same spot, the bee parasites are like, wonderful. But, you know, this is a great thing to do, like, with a kid, right? To, like, encourage that sort of stewardship. Like, there's a value to that. Even a brush pile. God bless laziness, right? Like, I did this before I knew it was a thing, but that's just because I didn't want all the way, right? But that does a lot, right? Leaving your leaves does so much actually to support all of these insects that live on the ground and that need that leaf litter. More laziness. Just don't mow in the spring. Right? Those weeds are wonderful. Leaving open soil, your grass does not need to be perfect. The open soil is a place for ground nesting bees. It's wonderful. That's what they need. They need bare soil. Leaving things like logs, snags, other dead trees, debris around. And finally, when you can, always adding a little bit of water, especially a little bit of moving water, a little bit of still water is okay. Moving water is even better. It's really, really attractive for a lot of these guys. Creates a little bit of extra habitat.
I found having a water feature actually, like on a pond, and at first I was concerned about having a lot of mosquitoes, but actually having a pond means fewer mosquitoes if you have a balanced ecosystem.
Exactly right.
Frogs and dragonflies.
Yeah, somebody Nobody wants to eat mosquitoes.
Exactly.
Yeah, 100%. So I think we've probably done a lot of questions already, which I love. But I am going to say let's take a just a 5-minute break and then come back. And I will absolutely be here after class if you have more questions, or you can come to me during the 5-minute break. But if you just like need to talk about insects, I'm obviously here for it. So don't worry, we will get those questions answered, okay? And so after our 5-minute break, we're going to come back at 11, and we are going to do our activity stations. Good?